I'm Travis, REGENESIS Permaculture Costa Rica. Welcome to part 3 of our Pasture to Paradise webinar series. In this part, we're going to talk about the challenges and opportunities of degraded pastures. I'm going to first show this a map of our lovely planet. The areas in red are areas either at high risk or currently undergoing desertification, which is basically the death of the existing ecosystem, turning into desert, which is an ecosystem that very, very slowly or not at all is regenerating. And so on the edge, we'll often find forest or savanna, and those ecosystems naturally regenerate. If we cut down the forest, pioneer species will return and eventually trees will grow again. But if the ecosystem has been altered so much that regeneration stops, then it heads into this desertification. So the problem with a desert, of course, there's not water, and it's a series of compounding things. So, for example, the soil erosion, because of the exposure, there's no ground cover. The rains that do fall, because the soil is so dry and compact and doesn't have any organic material to absorb it, the waters just run off, and actually if there is a big rain, it becomes a flooding. In the pastures here, the soils are compacted, so once upon a time there were tree roots that went down deep, and those have been cut and dead for a long time here in these pastures. The animals, maybe they were first used for agriculture and now just for cows and pasture. And so those air pockets in the soil's ability to receive water and hold the water has pretty much been lost, and as has the biodiversity and the productivity. Also in these degraded pastures where cows just roam freely and aren't under the holistic management I'll talk about shortly, they're at high risk to pathogens because they eat less diversity. They tend to just cherry pick the sweetest grasses, and they also tend to hang out in the same places and sit in their poo, and so the pathogen cycle is increased, and then these animals are treated with pharmaceuticals, which people who consume meats are then ingesting. The pastures are not the problem, it's the lack of management. So there's this holistic rotational grazing. This is a great opportunity, a great solution. There are many people using this, the rotational grazing of animals, and economically, with very small capital to start up, are creating very productive businesses, as well as providing good quality product for the people who are consuming meat or animal product. Now, regardless of one's belief or intentions, humanity and the planet are at a point of crisis, and so using whatever tools available to make it through this transition with as much ease and grace and joy as possible, I'm all in favor of that. And I respect people who choose to be vegetarian or vegan, and thank you for that. And I also respect the majority of humanity that isn't in that position yet, isn't with that same perspective. And to be clear, yes, there's a very, very big difference between industrial meat in terms of the ecological impact and also the health impact. Now, when animals are raised with holistic grazing, which means they're rotating and moving, imitating natural herds that had predators pressuring them, moving them, they eat a much broader range of foods. They improve the soil, and as they're moving, the pathogen cycle is disrupted because they're not returning and eating the same food that has their fecal matter and microbes in it. And there's a long history of humanity with either grazing animals or hunting animals that are on the savannas or on the edge of the food forest. And so it's part of the history. Doesn't mean it's part of our future, but I feel it's a very important part of the transition. 2 more points here. I want to zoom into this diagram that shows how intensive agriculture and social inequality are interconnected. And this is basically how the cycle of poverty, how it feeds more the destruction of ecosystems because people don't have other ways to meet their needs, at least that they know about. And so food insecurity and poverty, degenerative agricultural practices, deforestation, destruction of ecosystems, soil degradation, global warming, climate change, social injustice, fires and floods and biodiversity loss, all these things are very interconnected. And so to try to treat one without treating the others is not the best way to go. We need to look at them kind of collectively. And so planting food forests and perhaps using rotational grazing animals as an economic engine for a couple years in this time of transition, it works. The last thing I guess mention, these African grasses that were brought over, the Bracharia brisanta, these grasses are very tough and resilient, and it's not fun, it's not easy, unless you're with friends having a good time, to pull out the pasture to prepare it for planting food forests. And these grasses were brought over specifically because they are very resistant. They were the grasses that survived the giant herds of wildebeest and zebras and elephants. And so they're, in many cases, maybe the most resistant grasses on the planet. And they do a very good job of not allowing other things to grow. So they really slow down the natural regeneration in the pastures. And so it's a little more work for us. Our job is to use these grasses that are there in the best way possible. So if it's with animals, okay, that's a very reasonable way to go. And if not, to use them as chop and drop and mulch to mulch the edges of our tree rows where we're planting. And to do this most effectively, we want to allow the grass to grow as much as possible. And just as we see the grass beginning to seed or go to flower, actually when it begins to go to flower is when we want to chop it. And that's because the grass, as it's growing, its metabolism is fastest. And once it begins to flower, the metabolism slows down. And this is true of plants in general. And so we want to keep the metabolism going because we want to maximize photosynthesis, maximize the plant respiration, and build the biomass to use this material as mulch to feed the soil food web, to feed our plants, and to create a border between our tree row that we're planting and the pasture that can be very aggressive and invasive. And this concludes part 3 of the Pasture to Paradise webinar series. Remember to like, follow, love, share, subscribe, and plant trees. And we will see you in the next part 4, where we talk about site assessment, planning, and